Well, it's good to be here as we open the 29th Yale-Edinburgh Conference. The death of Professor Lamansani is on all our minds. And the conference this year is dedicated to the memory of our dear departed friend and co-founder of this conference. So the immediate purpose of my lecture is to honor his memory, as he should be the one standing here in front of you, and I'm a poor substitute. The larger purpose of my lecture, however, is to put the Yale-Edinburgh Conference into some kind of historical perspective. Given also the imminent retirement of Brian Stanley, the Edinburgh leader of the group, it's a good time to pause and to evaluate the conference's place in history. My talk, therefore, will try to do several things. First, I will try to chart the historical development of the academic discourse of world Christianity, just touching on some high points, especially with reference to the mainline Anglophone North American Protestant discourse. Second, I will locate the Yale-Edinburgh Conference in this history, since this is the stream from which this school comes and is part of. I will show that the role it played in naming the discourse of what we now call world Christianity. Recalling this history is important for going forward into the second and third generations of our research. And then thirdly, by introducing the language of world Christianity, the Yale-Edinburgh Conference brought forth together several different academic streams that originated in mission studies and other places, packaged them into a post-colonial context that has now found acceptance in broader circles. So we want to see what are the issues going forward in world Christianity and mission history. And in a sense, our whole conference will be reflecting on that as we move toward our discussion at the end of the conference. Now, a few caveats are in order. I am not giving a talk on historiography. I actually have something like an 80-page manuscript on historiography that I'm not sure I'll live to finish, but this is not about the historiography of world Christianity, nor is it about all of the wonderful things going on in world Christianity itself. It's a kind of a narrow discourse history. So let me start then with the first context to bring up, namely that of world evangelization, cooperation, and colonialism around 1910 forward, which I'm putting as the beginning point of this discourse with the beginning of mission studies. And I want to start with an image. Here's the original logo for the YMCA from 1881. Notice what it says. It refers to John 17:21. That they may all be one, as you, Father, are in me and I am in you. May they also be in us, so the world may believe you have sent me. And notice the names of the continents are put around the edge of this open Bible. This vision, global vision that the YMCA and that students had for going into the world was a worldwide vision, including all of the continents of the world, at a time when roughly 80% of all Christians were of European background. So this is the vision that you can see them starting with. We all know of the importance of the Edinburgh 1910 conference, and it brought together many of the streams of it was at the height of European imperialism. There was unprecedented interest in missions on the part of Protestants. Young people were energized by the possibility of evangelizing the world in their own generation and used the technologies of the day to take the gospel to, quote, non-Christian parts of the world. It's interesting to read about their excitement about wireless. That's not what they mean by wireless now. They mean radio and things like that. The steamship, railroad, telegraph energized a kind of mentality of globalization. And the head of this conference, of course, was John Mott, who was the head of the World's Alliance of YMCA. So it was a straight movement from the student movement. Now, what were the things that moved us toward this discourse of world Christianity? First, we had study reports of the World Church done ahead of the conference itself. The conference developed atlases, surveys, a journal, the International Review of Missions, came out of the conference. So you start some real attention to documentation was on people's minds in that room. There was a visible multiculturalism. Even though only about 20 representatives were from the so-called younger churches, they gave 6 out of 47 addresses. And since the representatives were from missionaries from all over the world, there was a building excitement about the possibilities, the realities of what today we would call multiculturalism. A third thing that came out of Edinburgh in 1910 that's important for our discussion here is the solidification of and professionalization of mission studies. This was the point that then is energizing the Day Missions Library. It founded the Hartford School of Missions, the launching of social science and mission. There was a lot of attention to what is it people need to know to be in ministry in the world and in cross-cultural situations. So meetings of mission professors emerged out of this movement. And the birth of area studies comes out of this, and I'll talk about that in just a minute. So let me look now at the role of Yale Divinity School, which is one of the main themes going through my talk today. And I'll have to count on someone from Edinburgh next year, perhaps, to give a full story of how the Edinburgh piece fits in. But Harlan Page Beach was the educational secretary of the student Christian movement. Remember that Edinburgh 1910 was the student Christian movement grown up and moving into mission societies. In 1906, Beach became the first professor of missions at Yale Divinity School. He was intensely interested in documentation. He produced a series of atlases that defined the world mission movement. And he reported to the Edinburgh Conference that Yale Divinity School had the largest collection of mission literature in North America and had raised $100,000 to build a mission library, which we see now as the Day Mission Library. Not only was Yale hosting a full 3-year graduate program to train missionary candidates, said Beach, it was also planning to introduce the study of Chinese language in order to staff the Yale in China program, which was a mission movement coming out of Yale. In 1911, Beach became head then of the Day Missions Library and presided over it until 1921, when he was succeeded by Kenneth Scott Latourette. So you had a presence here at Yale Divinity School who was really anchoring the documentation side of what is becoming mission studies and eventually becomes world Christianity. Now, I mentioned that I think area studies is one of the big pieces that comes out of Edinburgh 1910 afterward. This is a huge subject area, but I just want to point out that systematic collection and documentation and analysis of world history, world religions, indigenous customs, music, poetry, and so on was pouring out of the scholarly side of the mission movement at this point and having a huge ricochet impact on scholarship in North America and Europe. And I just mentioned this one piece of the missionary John Farquhar, who became literature secretary of the YMCA in 1903. Notice this common theme, YMCA, one of the first global Christian organizations on the Protestant side. Farquhar was fluent in Bengali and Sanskrit, and he commissioned and edited 3 book series on the history of Indian religions, folk customs, vernacular literature, including the history of Indian Christianity. And he and Bishop Azariah, pictured here, were the co-editors of something called the Heritage of India series. So what you have, you see, is in the 1920s and 30s, following the period of the Yale-Edinburgh Conference is the infiltration, the sharing of this knowledge of the world cultures coming back into academia. So Kenneth Scott Latourette, when he becomes mission professor succeeding Beach, he brings in Chinese Christianity as a major area of scholarship. You have people like Philip Hitti, who brings in Near Eastern studies at Princeton Seminary. Now, all of this area studies scholarship is mostly located in linguistic or language departments. Historians, frankly, were not very interested yet in the world. You know, it was mostly Western history in the history departments. But then we see along comes someone like Kenneth Scott Latourette, who had been a missionary in China. He's the D. Willis James Professor and then becomes Sterling Professor of Missions and, quote, Oriental History from 1921 to 53. And his two-volume history of the Chinese was the standard work in American schools for many years. So in addition to his writing on the history of Christianity, the history of the expansion of Christianity, which, believe it or not, was still the name of the courses being taught when I was a student here in the late 70s, History of the Expansion of Christianity. He's linking together the historical study of a particular part of the world with the history of Christianity. And this is something that then becomes part of the Yale tradition. Now, in addition then to these academic concerns, I want to just summarize this period by saying at an ecclesial level, the term people were using was cooperation, not ecumenism. That was later. The idea of we must cooperate to provide Christian literature, to have joint projects for Bible translation, to support collaborative institutions of higher education in Asia, to found regional councils of churches and joint action on ethical issues. So this was the mentality, you could say, of Protestant education from 1910 to the 1930s. It was also colonialist. The assumptions were colonialist. Even though there was resistance there, so at Edinburgh in 1910, there was discussion of how the colonial government in Congo was taking all the land and how there was oppression of Koreans by Japanese. Okay, those were discussed, but they weren't on the front burner. The assumption was that colonialism was kind of a Christendom, colonial assumptions were reigning. And we had the development of mission studies, but not yet a discourse called world Christianity. So let me move then to my next period, where I'm just going to jump a bit to the 1940s forward to something I call one world, one church, one mission. And by the 1940s, increasingly the term ecumenical movement was being used for the unity movements that were developing out of missionary engagement. Among mainline Protestant leaders, including scholars, a steadily increasing commitment to global political and economic unity was expressed by the phrase, one world. And the longing for world unity peaked during the Second World War, both in religious and secular realms. Given the threat of worldwide communism on one side and fascism on the other, the idea of Christianity as a kind of a political or cultural or worldwide united movement that was neither fascism nor communism, that would support a kind of democracy and focus on the individual instead of just systems. There was a lot of collaborative conversation around this that was deeply impacting mission conversation. And so we have this logo of the World Council of Churches that's founded in 1948, the same time as the United Nations. The idea, oikoumene, there's one world, one inhabited world with one church. You need one church to deal with the massive interconnected problems of one world. And here I'd like to just put in two quotations because it's in the 40s that the language of world Christianity starts to be used for this idea of world church. I have put two quotations here to show you the ethical impact, the ethical substance of this idea of world Christianity in the 1940s. You see Edmund Soper, who was mission professor at Garrett. He had been first dean of Duke Divinity School and was a missionary kid. They held meetings in the early 40s about Christian bases of world order. Now, Soper also wrote a groundbreaking book called Racism as a World Problem, where he showed the connection between casteism in India, segregation in the US, apartheid in South Africa, and how those were all interconnected. Of course, in the history of literature, no one ever remembers he was a missionary person, right? That's seen as a secular work, part of our historiographic struggle in this field. But Soper said, world order has a moral and spiritual base, and the fundamental issues involved in world order are the concern of men of goodwill everywhere. World order is related to the world mission of the Christian church. But you see this global intent, this global ethical public theology. And then Henry Van Dusen, the dean of Union Theological Seminary, writes a book called World Christianity. Only a world church is effective amidst planetary war. To an age destined to survive or to expire as one world, we bring a world church. And you can see Van Dusen heavily reliant on the historical scheme of Kenneth Scott Latourette. His whole book, he just goes through Latourette's schema was used as the basis for Van Dusen and the other theologians. You know, you've got kind of instrumentalist use of your mission of history here, used by public theologians to talk about where we are and where we're going. Now, the high point of this kind of ecumenical optimism, I would put in the early 1960s, especially when you've got the first meeting of the World Council of Churches with the International Missionary Council in Mexico City in 1963. This is also the first meeting where the Orthodox play a full role and merge into and join the World Council of Churches. Simultaneously, there's the Second Vatican Council, and Protestants go from being heretics to merely just being separated brethren in the eyes of the Roman Catholic Church. So you see the convergence here, huge optimism on the part of kind of mainline Protestantism toward world unity, world church, ecumenism, and so on. Okay, well, what happened to that? Well, okay. There was this movement there, and then you could say a collapse. They were wrong about organic unity movements. In fact, Pitt Van Dusen said he predicted that by the year 2000, all churches would be united, except for the Roman Catholics and the sectarians. Now, what's wrong with this picture? You know, I always tell my students, if you're a historian, never predict. Never predict. You're going to be wrong. So the sectarians that weren't paying any attention to were the evangelicals and the Pentecostals and the indigenous churches that are rapidly growing at the same time. And then, of course, mainline Christians voted down most of those church unity movements in massive failure in the 1960s. So world Christianity itself was a completely failed discourse. I mean, it completely dropped away. It's like consensus history gave way to conflict history. Because another thing that was happening, even at this height of ecumenical optimism, is that Christians from around the world were busily decolonizing Christianity. And there was a move toward moratorium on the mission movement. There was a cry for liberation theologies. And so out of this, though, does come the naming of the need for self-theologizing. Now, one of the pieces of this are the beginning of regional church history projects. And I can't go into that here, but it was, I think, one of the steps toward world Christianity that we should put in the historiography, if we're doing a historiography, is to look at Sahila and Chai and the African Church History Project and other regional histories, collaborative histories of Christianity that are starting to be written in the 1970s and 80s. So let's see, where does this go next? Now I want to go to the third and final period, which is where we are now, that I'm going to talk to lead up to. So by the 1970s, the idea of world Christianity was like yesterday's leftover coffee. You toss it down the drain and forget about it. Amid cries of missionary go home by councils of churches in Asia, Africa, and Latin America, the mission structures of Western mainline Protestantism declined or morphed into development agencies. Contextual and local theologies replaced these integrative models of ecumenical unity so beloved by the older generation. Theologians of pluralism and secularism rejected evangelization as a form of imperialism, and an alternative evangelical movement gathered strength and rejected that hard-won ecumenical framework. So in retrospect, what we can now see is that the dominant framework here in mainline mission studies from the 1960s to the 90s was of decolonization and post-colonialism. Just as modernization undercut societies all over the world, modernization and secularization undercut Western society as well. Undercut's probably the wrong word, but you know what I mean. These changes in just the way of thinking of being religious were happening everywhere. And so the stalwart programs of mission studies eliminated them one by one. So, for example, in 1971, the University of Chicago, its mission professor was retired, never to be replaced. Here at Yale, there was a split the same year. Religious studies was seen as modern and secular, and all the church subjects were left in the Divinity School, including mission studies and all things global. Now, when I got here in 1978, there was nothing going on, kind of structurally. There was no such thing as world Christianity. I came here wanting to study something I called to myself comparative Christianity, and did exams, an extra doctoral exam, think of that, in African Christianity in order to compare two different kinds of Christianity. That was really weird, in the late 1970s. But there were a range of missionary kids here on the faculty and in the library who nevertheless were interested in the world church and in world Christianity. And so I had to put up here my teachers, the two directors of my dissertation, Charles Foreman and George Lindbeck, both missionary kids, and then hiding in a small room that was becoming an archive was Martha Smalley, also from a missionary family. And so things were going on, percolating at Yale Divinity School in the 1970s. Let's see. Well, what happened here? Okay. I'm getting so excited when I see my old teachers. Okay. I go visit their pictures every time I come here. But what we had, though, I'm looking at showing things on the side. I don't know how to get rid of that. I'm not going to worry about that. There's also a demographic shift of Christian population to Africa, Asia, and Latin America. So things were changing on the ground, despite the kind of collapse of the mission studies discourse. And here's where I want to point out now the great Scot, Andrew Walls, who, as we all know, who's sitting right here, who recalled that he's teaching in West Africa, and he said, I'm teaching about second century Christianity, but it's happening all around me. And so people like Andrew Walls begin to notice that the world church is growing, and that even as the secularization paradigm is dominating Western institutions like Yale Divinity School, something is happening on the ground. So Andrew Walls takes this knowledge back to Scotland, and these are just some of his accomplishments. In 1967, he founds the Journal of Religion in Africa. He founds a religious studies department at the University of Aberdeen in 1970, and in 1982, the Center of Christianity in the non-Western world. Notice we're still not using the term world Christianity. So let me see, I'm going to jump ahead. Mission studies kind of regroups during the 1970s. I'll pass over that. Well, this is not letting me do what I want to in terms of, yeah, help me. Yeah. So tech expert.
No, just.
I want to go back into slideshow.
Okay, yeah, I just need to get the arrow right there. There you go.
Thank you so much. It's not often that the dean is the tech expert in the room. Okay. I think the turning point toward where we are now was 1989. And here are a few factors that I want to bring up for why 1989. The fall of the Berlin Wall and the end of the Soviet Union. This freed up people to express Christianity in terms of their own local idioms, rather than seeing it as a byproduct of Cold War politics. Another thing in 1989 is the Lausanne movement and the World Council both held big meetings in which there's a convergence of their mission theologies. And the next year, 2 years later, the Pope's encyclical, the next year, Redemptoris Missio, means that by 1990, all the major church communions are kind of in the same place theologically. Then we have Lamin Sane's book, Translating the Message. Now, this book was published in the American Society of Missiology series. And I knew Lamin since 1984 when I was teaching at BU and he was teaching at Harvard Divinity. And I will never forget, though, when he came in 1989 to the ASM, Missiology Society, to talk about his book. And all of the mission scholars in there knew it was just a huge game changer. Because here was someone from Africa saying, let's move beyond the colonialist paradigm. All African Christians are not running dogs of imperialists. That is the kind of argumentation that keeps Westerners and Western guilt in the center of the story in perpetuity. So his presentation there of his new book that was just coming out in the ASM series was just the beginning of a kind of scholarly turning point that leads us to our conference here. Then another thing is in 1989, the Pew Charitable Trusts awarded the Overseas Ministry Study Center, under the direction of Gerald Anderson, who's also sitting here, a grant to fund Seismic, the Scholars Initiative for Studies in Mission and International Christianity. The OMSC had just moved to New Haven 2 years before, was publishing the highest circulation mission journal of the era, and Joel Carpenter, also sitting here, of the Pew Charitable Trusts, asked Jerry Anderson to explore the scholarly infrastructure needed to bring the awareness of worldwide Christianity to the Academy. Jerry Anderson gathered together Lamin Sane, newly arrived at Yale Divinity School, Andrew Walls, who by then had moved to Edinburgh, Steve Peterson, the librarian at Yale Divinity School, and a team of 18 scholars to advise Pew for what became a multi-million-dollar infusion of research money to study mission history and Christianity worldwide. Andrew Walls gave the keynote address to Seismic that laid out the needed agenda for the next steps. And I remember it well because I was sitting right there. He called for documentation and preservation of sources. He called for collaborative research projects and he called for the de-Westernization of the church history curricula in schools around the world. He also argued that to move mission studies out of its academic isolation, we should invest in research that would integrate mission studies with other academic disciplines. With the report from Seismic in hand, in 1992, the Pew Trust started awarding major research advancement grants to scholars for large collaborative projects in non-Western Christianity. And Joel Carpenter recalls, he said, from 1900 through 1995, Pew's religion program made grants totaling over $13 million in this field, including $1 million to the Edinburgh's Center. Now, what's the lesson here? If you pay for it, they will come. And from 1992 to 1999, the Research Enablement Program channeled Pew funds into 110 individual scholarly projects on all aspects of world Christianity. This was our committee that awarded the money to 110 different scholars. You'll notice there, a very young me, all the way over on the left, and who am I standing next to? John Pobey, the great theologian from Ghana. There's Jerry Anderson in the middle. The late Jose Miguez Benino, Mary Mott, who was doing Catholic mission history. Behind her, Dan Bays, recently deceased, Chinese Christianity historian. Bob Frickenberg, Indologist, Indian Christianity. In the middle, you see the late Paul Hebert, the mission anthropologist. Next to him, David Kerr, the great expert in Middle Eastern Christianity. And then staff person, Jeff Little. Now, I've had this picture on my desk since 1995, because what this shows is how the people trying to launch what we now call world Christianity had an interdisciplinary focus. It also shows an attempt to work in all different parts of the world at the same time. Admittedly, it's mostly Western here, but it was a beginning. So that was the beginning. Now, I've gone back and looked at the names of all the projects. Not one of them used the name World Christianity, those 110 projects. But one talked about the world church. So when did the term world Christianity start being used to denote this new scholarly endeavor? It began, okay, and here's a summary of the steps. Seismic, 1989, and then 1992, and further on, and then it kind of culminates on the Currents in World Christianity project under Brian Stanley and Mark Hutchinson. But a little conference was held in 1992 where the term world Christianity was used for the first time. This was the Yale-Edinburgh conference. We couldn't find a picture of the first meeting, though I do remember we posed for a picture. But this is a picture of us in 2015, and those of us who were old by then, founders, sitting on the front. And okay, you get to sit down when you're old. You know, you get a chair instead of standing. But you see, the term world Christianity starts being used in 1992. And then by the year 2000, it's all over the place with the Currents in World Christianity project. And there's a dispute as to whether Lamin Sani or Andrew Walls first hit upon the term world Christianity. And I'm not sure how we resolve that dispute now. But this collaborative project was the first use of the term. Now, and then the discourse of world Christianity begins to spread. It spreads in 1999. Lamin and I gave talks about the new discourse at the American Society of Church History. By 2005, the AAR started a world Christianity group. Then documentation centers and research centers are founded. In 2001, we found the Center for Global Christianity at BU. In 2003, The Center for the Study of Global Christianity that does the demography moves to Gordon Conwell. And then, of course, in 2002 was Philip Jenkins' blockbuster book, The Next Christendom, The Coming of Global Christianity, in which half the people sitting in this room now were in his footnotes. So there was a huge now, kind of like, it appeared from nowhere feeling about world Christianity around 2002. Okay, so I need to keep moving on. This is just an image I wanted to use to talk about, when we talk about Christianity today, the Global Christian Forum. Notice it's a mosaic cross. In other words, when we think about world Christianity today, it's not that image of ecumenical unity from 1960. It is talking about there's multiculturalism, there are many different facets to world Christianity that together make the cross, but it's got many varieties and many different aspects. Okay, I'm going to skip over this and let me move into my conclusion now because I'm running out of time here. I'd like to suggest why the Yale-Edinburgh Conference has been historically important and raise a few questions for the future. Given the history I've just sketched, I see some of the chief contributions of the Yale-Edinburgh Conference as follows. First, it named world Christianity as a post-colonial global approach to mission history. By starting with mission history, there's the linkage with what has gone before and a post-colonial approach signaling the dawn of a whole new era of scholarship. The scholarly productivity that came out of those programs in the 1990s and the naming of it in 1992 has been huge. That's why we're still here 29 years later. Second, the Yale-Edinburgh conferences demonstrated the importance of the Dane Missions Library for documentation and access. Back then, the powers that be wanted to disperse the archives and disperse what was in the Dane Missions Library and restrict access to its use, even though mission people had been donating their materials for decades with the understanding they would get public exposure and use by visiting scholars. And my teacher, Charles Foreman, was on a picket line, picketing Yale University to say, you can't do this to our heritage. So one of the purposes of the Yale-Edinburgh Conference was to say, let's meet where this documentation is. Let's bring scholars here. Let's reaffirm the importance of the documentation of the history of the world Christian movement. And so that was one of the purposes of the meeting, and also it was to show that there were actually a lot of people interested in these archives and in this library. It's not just a few scholars from the West. Another thing that I think the Yale-Edinburgh Conference succeeded in doing is it reasserted the role of university-based divinity schools and research centers as incubators of innovative scholarship. There's a way in which, when I started in religious studies, the Divinity School had fallen on hard times and seen there was a separation between real scholarship and those churchy people over there. Well, this whole movement was launched by university-based divinity schools. Yale and Edinburgh and other schools, which themselves embody the linkage between what we might now call lived religion and serious scholarship. That is something that can't be taken lightly, and that is one of the great accomplishments, I think, of the Yale-Edinburgh collaboration all these years. And then, of course, it has sustained transatlantic and now trans-Pacific collaborative scholarship, also not easily done. Collaborative scholarship is tough, and believe me, when you go up for tenure, you don't get credit for it in the same way that you do for individual scholarship. So what are some of the challenges now that we face as we move into the next generation? Well, I'd say the first challenge is that the initial goals have been accomplished. We now have got lots of papers on world Christianity at the American Society of Church History. There are now multiple journals that publish on world Christianity. There's a way in which when I was in 1980 said what I was interested in, people would glaze over. You know, now you go to a professional meeting and there are lots of people using mission archives as a source for scholarship in all different areas, including area studies, historical studies, and the like. So the initial goals have been accomplished. And once that happens, you need to reassess. What are the goals for the next generation? The founding generation is passing through death and retirement. That also means, that is very sad, and I grieve the loss of my old friends. But it's also now that you're out of the way, what is it we feel like doing? You know, as someone in her 60s who's kind of next on the list to fall off the cliff in a few years, we all know that scholarship, you know, it builds on the past, but it takes the vision of a contemporary younger generation to build something for the future. So that's one of the challenges. The founding generation is passing. Then we have our infrastructure changes. That money that Joel Carpenter channeled to building up what we now call world Christianity no longer exists anywhere. And Joel Carpenter deserves a huge amount of credit for his vision and taking on the tough work of an administrator to get us funded so that we could have a flowering of the kind of scholarship we're interested in. But that kind of money is not anywhere anymore, as far as one can see. The OMSC is moving, people retire and pass away, so academic positions change and so forth. And then finally, we still, no matter how much work is done, there needs to be better support for younger scholars. Cross-cultural networking is both more possible with the internet and yet even more difficult, but yet more necessary than ever before. We need more cross-cultural networking and appreciation for documentation, such as here at the Yale Divinity School Library and in other places. That appreciation for documentation is something that's needed around the world. So let me just conclude with a personal note. When I began my PhD in religious studies here in 1978, there was no such thing as world Christianity. And by that, of course, I mean there was no academic discourse. My earliest memories growing up next to the sugarcane fields in Plaquemine, Louisiana, stirred in me a desire to study both American Christianity and African Christianity. So I came here interested in what I to myself called comparative Christianity. And in the late 70s, the only academics who were interested in Christianity in the, quote, two-thirds world had been missionaries or were missionary kids. In the secularizing post-colonial critique context of the late 70s, these were people who were walking like ghosts in the hallway where American students thought of people like Charles Foreman as an old fossil. But through the back door, mission studies became a lifeline to people like me and others who are sitting in the room. 40 years later, I can celebrate that something called world Christianity is spread widely across the academic landscape. And the Yale-Edinburgh Conference reminds us that we stand on the shoulders of visionary scholars of multiple generations who've gone before us.